The flames were already climbing the walls of the barn when Thomas Whitfield finally fell to his knees, not from exhaustion, not from pain, but from the weight of watching everything he had built for 23 years turn to ash and smoke in the cold October air. His wife Mary was screaming somewhere behind him. He could hear her, but he could not turn around, could not look away from the fire, because standing right beside him, close enough that Thomas could feel the heat of his breath against his ear, was the man who had ordered it all. Bill Anderson. Bloody Bill, the most feared guerrilla fighter in Missouri. The man with 53 scalps braided into his saddle. The man who had killed more Union soldiers in 6 months than most Confederate units, managed in 3 years. And right now, he was watching Thomas Whitfield's entire life burn. But here is what you need to understand. What happened on this farm that October morning in 1864 was not random cruelty. It was not senseless violence. There was a reason Bill Anderson made this man watch his own food supply go up in flames. A reason that changes everything you think you know about this story. Because 6 hours earlier, Thomas Whitfield had looked Bill Anderson directly in the eyes, and he had lied. It started with hunger. 4 days. Bill Anderson's guerrillas had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days. They had been riding hard through the back roads of Missouri, staying ahead of Union patrols that seemed to multiply with every passing week. The leaves were turning gold and red, the air growing colder with each dawn, and winter was coming fast. 27 men rode with Bill that October, 27 hollow-eyed, gaunt-faced men who had given everything for a war they were slowly realizing could not be won. They had survived battles, they had survived ambushes, they had survived things that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. But hunger was different. Hunger made men desperate. Hunger made men careless. Hunger made men do things they would never do with full stomachs and clear heads. Jesse James was 17 years old that October. He rode near the back of the column, his eyes scanning the tree line out of habit, his stomach cramping with every jarring step of his horse. Years later, after he had become the most famous outlaw in American history, Jesse would talk about those 4 days. The hunger was worse than getting shot. At least when you get shot, you know it will either kill you or heal. Hunger just keeps going. It eats you from the inside, makes you see things that are not there, makes you think thoughts you would never think. Bill Anderson knew his men were reaching their limit. He had seen the looks they exchanged when they thought he was not watching. He had heard the whispers around the cold camps at night. No fires. They could not risk fires. So they huddled in the dark, shivering and starving, and wondered how much longer they could keep going. Bill needed to find food, not just for morale, for survival. And that is when they saw the farm. It sat in a small valley about half a mile off the main road. A modest farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney, a large barn, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden, mostly harvested but showing signs of recent care. Most importantly, it showed signs of prosperity. In October 1864, in the middle of war-torn Missouri, prosperity meant one thing: food. Bill raised his hand, bringing the column to a halt. His eyes never left the farm as he studied every detail. The condition of the fences, the health of the few cattle he could see in the distant pasture, the fact that there was smoke from the chimney at all. Most farms in this region had been abandoned months ago, their owners fleeing from both Union forces and Confederate guerrillas. This farmer had stayed. This farmer had something worth staying for. One of Bill's lieutenants, a man named George Todd, pulled his horse alongside Bill's. "What do you think?" Bill did not answer immediately. He was watching a figure emerge from the farmhouse. A man, middle-aged, walking toward the barn with a bucket in each hand. The man moved with the careful efficiency of someone who knew this land, who had worked it for years. "I think we found breakfast," Bill finally said. But even as he said it, something nagged at the back of his mind. Something he could not quite identify. A feeling that would make sense only hours later, when everything had gone wrong. Because Bill Anderson had learned to trust his instincts. They had kept him alive when better men had died. And right now, his instincts were telling him something was off about this farm. He ignored them. That was his first mistake. The guerrillas approached the farm in standard formation. Half the men hung back at the tree line, rifles ready, watching for any sign of Union troops or local militia. The other half rode slowly toward the farmhouse, their pistols visible but not drawn. Bill led them. He always led them. It was one of the reasons his men followed him into situations that would terrify most soldiers. Bill Anderson never asked anyone to face a danger he would not face first. The farmer saw them coming. Of course he did. You did not survive in Missouri in 1864 by being unobservant. He set down his buckets and stood very still, his eyes tracking the approaching riders with the wariness of prey watching predators. Bill noted everything: the farmer's age, somewhere around 50, his clothing, worn but well-maintained, his hands, calloused from years of work, his face, weathered with the kind of deep lines that came from squinting into the sun over decades of farming, and his eyes. His eyes were the eyes of a man who was afraid but trying very hard not to show it. Bill stopped his horse about 10 feet from the farmer. The rest of his men fanned out behind him, their presence a silent statement of force that required no translation. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Bill reached up and removed his hat, a gesture of respect that surprised even his own men. When Bill Anderson removed his hat, it usually meant he was about to do something that would give you nightmares, but not always. "Morning," Bill said. His voice was calm, almost polite. The farmer swallowed visibly. "Morning. Nice farm you have here." "Thank you." Bill replaced his hat, his eyes never leaving the farmer's face. "My men and I have been riding for a while. We have not eaten properly in some time. I was hoping you might be able to help with that." The farmer's jaw tightened, just slightly. Most people would not have noticed. But Bill Anderson noticed everything. The farmer began. He stopped, started again. "I am sorry, I do not have much. The war has been hard on everyone." Bill nodded slowly. "The war has been hard." "That is true." He paused. "What is your name?" "Whitfield." "Thomas Whitfield." "Thomas," Bill said, testing the name. "Let me tell you something about myself. I appreciate honesty. I value it highly. When a man tells me the truth, I remember it. When a man lies to me..." He left the sentence unfinished. The implication hung in the cold October air like smoke. "I am not lying," Thomas said. His voice was steady, but Bill could see the slight tremor in his hands. "We had a bad harvest. Union troops came through 3 weeks ago and took most of what we had. There is barely enough for my family to survive the winter." Bill studied him for a long moment. Behind him, he could hear one of his men's stomach growl audibly in the silence. "You have cattle," Bill said. "I can see them from here. 3 cows. For milk. We cannot slaughter them, or we will have nothing for the winter." "Chickens?" "A few. They are not laying well. The stress." Bill held up his hand, cutting him off. His eyes had shifted to something behind the farmer. The barn doors. They were closed, locked, with a padlock that looked newer than the rest of the barn's hardware. "What is in the barn, Thomas?" The farmer's face went pale, so quickly that even he must have known Bill saw it. "Farm equipment, the normal things. Then you will not mind if we take a look." The farmer's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I would prefer if you did not. There is nothing of value in there. Just tools and..." Bill dismounted from his horse in one fluid motion. The movement was so sudden, so smooth, that Thomas Whitfield actually took a step backward before he could stop himself. Bill walked toward the barn. His boots crunched on the fallen leaves. Behind him, he heard his men dismounting, the soft clicks of pistols being readied. The farmer followed, his voice rising with what sounded like desperation. "Please, sir, there is nothing in there, I told you. Just tools, old equipment, nothing you would want." Bill stopped at the barn door. His hand rested on the padlock. New, shiny, recently installed. He turned to look at Thomas Whitfield, really looked at him. And in that moment, he saw the truth that the farmer was trying so hard to hide. Fear, real fear. Not the fear of a man facing guerrilla fighters, but the fear of a man who was about to be caught in a lie. "Open it," Bill said softly. "I do not have the key with me. Then we will have to do this the hard way." Bill stepped back and drew his pistol in one motion. Before Thomas could react, Bill fired once. The padlock shattered. The sound echoed across the valley like a thunderclap, and in the silence that followed, Bill heard something, a gasp. A small, feminine gasp, coming from inside the barn. His blood ran cold. Because Bill Anderson had heard that sound before. In Kansas City, in a collapsing building. When his 14-year-old sister Josephine had been crushed to death, while Union soldiers stood outside and did nothing. He kicked the barn doors open so hard they nearly came off their hinges, and what he saw inside changed everything. The barn was not full of farm equipment. It was full of food. Barrels of salted pork stacked 3 high against the back wall, sacks of flour, at least 20 of them piled in neat rows, crates of preserved vegetables, smoked hams hanging from the rafters, bushels of apples, dried corn, beans, rice. Enough food to feed a small army for a month, enough food to feed Bill's 27 starving men for the entire winter. And standing in the middle of it all, frozen in terror, was a woman, Thomas Whitfield's wife. She had been counting inventory when the shot rang out. Now she stood among the abundance, a ledger book clutched to her chest, staring at Bill Anderson with eyes that already knew what was coming. Bill did not move for a very long time. His men crowded in behind him. He heard their sharp intakes of breath as they saw the food, heard the whispered curses, heard the sound of empty stomachs confronting more provisions than they had seen in months. But Bill did not hear any of it, because he was remembering something. I do not have much. The war has been hard on everyone, barely enough for my family to survive the winter. Thomas Whitfield had looked him in the eyes, had known his men were starving, had known they had not eaten in days, and he had lied. Bill turned around slowly. Thomas Whitfield was still standing where Bill had left him, but all the color had drained from his face. His wife let out a soft moan of despair. "You lied to me," Bill said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made it infinitely more terrifying than if he had screamed. "Please," Thomas whispered. "I was trying to protect my family. There have been other groups, raiders. They take everything and leave nothing. I was afraid." "You were afraid?" Bill nodded. He walked back toward the farmer, each step deliberate, measured. "I understand fear. I have been afraid many times in my life." He stopped directly in front of Thomas Whitfield, close enough to smell the man's terror. "But you know what I learned about fear, Thomas? Fear is no excuse for lying. Fear is no excuse for watching men starve while you hoard enough food to feed a village. I did not know you were starving, I did not." "You knew." Bill's voice hardened. "You saw my men. You saw how thin they are. You saw the hunger in their eyes, and you looked at me and you lied." He grabbed Thomas by the collar, pulling him close. "My sister was 14 years old when she died. 14. The Union locked her in a building and let it collapse on top of her. She screamed for 6 minutes before she went silent. Do you know what her last word was?" Thomas shook his head frantically. "She called for our mother. She called for Mama while the walls came down on her. And do you know what the Union officer said when they pulled her broken body from the rubble?" Bill's face was inches from Thomas now. He said it was unfortunate. That is what he called the death of my 14-year-old sister. Unfortunate. Bill released the farmer, stepping back. Thomas stumbled but did not fall. "I hunted that officer for 8 days, Bill continued. "When I found him, I gave him 10 seconds to pray, then I shot him in the exact same place my sister was crushed, the chest, because I wanted him to know what it felt like to have something pressed down on him until he could not breathe anymore." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Do you know why I am telling you this, Thomas?" The farmer shook his head again. He could not speak, could barely stand. "Because I want you to understand something. I do not enjoy killing. I do not enjoy violence. But I hate liars. I hate them more than I hate Union soldiers, more than I hate the men who killed my sister. Because at least Union soldiers are honest about wanting to destroy us. At least they do not pretend to be something they are not." Bill walked back toward the barn, toward the food, toward the woman who was now quietly weeping. "You looked at my starving men," Bill said over his shoulder. "You looked at men who have not eaten in 4 days, men who have lost brothers and fathers and sons to this war, and you told them there was nothing to spare." He stopped at the barn entrance. "You did not lie to protect your family, Thomas. You lied because you decided our lives were not worth the truth. You looked at us and you saw... what? Bandits? Animals? Something less than human?" Bill turned to face him one more time. "Now I am going to show you what happens when you treat men like animals." "Bring me a torch," he said to his men. And Thomas Whitfield's nightmare began. What happened next would haunt the Whitfield family for 3 generations. Bill Anderson did not burn everything. That is important to understand. Because the story that survives in local history, the story that gets told in Missouri taverns and around campfires, that story says Bill Anderson destroyed the entire farm and left the family with nothing. That story is not entirely accurate. What Bill actually did was worse, because it was precise, calculated, designed not just to punish, but to teach a lesson that Thomas Whitfield would never forget. First, Bill had his men carry out exactly half of the food stores, half the flour, half the salted pork, half the preserved vegetables. They loaded it onto the Whitfields' own wagon, which they found in a shed behind the barn. Thomas watched in silence. His wife had been moved to the farmhouse, guarded by 2 of Bill's younger guerrillas. Their 15-year-old son had not appeared yet, and Bill made a mental note of that. He wondered where the boy was hiding. He wondered if the boy had a rifle. He wondered if the boy would be stupid enough to use it. The food transfer took about 2 hours. When it was complete, Bill inspected the remaining stores in the barn. Still plenty for a family of 3 to survive the winter. More than plenty, actually. But Bill was not finished. "Stack it," he ordered, pointing to the remaining food. "Stack it all in the center of the barn. Everything that is left." His men looked at each other uncertainly. One of them, a veteran named Marcus Cole, stepped forward. "Bill, if we are taking what we need, why?" "I said stack it." The tone left no room for argument. The men began moving the remaining food, creating a pile in the center of the barn that grew higher and higher until it nearly reached the rafters. Thomas Whitfield watched every movement. His hands were shaking now, not from cold. When the pile was complete, Bill walked around it slowly, inspecting it, making sure nothing had been missed. Then he turned to Thomas. "You told me you barely had enough to survive the winter. Those were your exact words." The farmer said nothing. Bill reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something, a piece of fabric, faded and stained, folded carefully despite its worn condition. "Do you know what this is?" Thomas shook his head. "It is a dress. A little girl's dress. It belonged to my sister Josephine. She was wearing it when she died." Bill held up the dress, letting it unfold. Even after 18 months, the bloodstains were still visible. "I carry this with me everywhere I go, every day, every night, every battle, every meal I eat. This dress sits beside my plate. Do you know why?" The farmer could not answer. "Because I never want to forget what it feels like to lose something precious because of other people's choices. I never want to forget the weight of helplessness, the rage that comes when someone takes from you and does not even have the decency to be honest about it." Bill carefully refolded the dress and placed it back in his saddlebag. "You have lied to men who have lost everything, Thomas. Men who have lost sisters and mothers and fathers to this war. Men who have nothing left except each other and the slim hope that one day this will all end." He walked toward the farmer, stopping just a few feet away. "So here is what is going to happen. My men are going to take what they need, and you are going to watch the rest burn." Thomas's eyes went wide. "No, please, my family." "Your family will have what we leave them," Bill interrupted, "which is more than my family has, more than many families in Missouri have. But we will starve and no, you will struggle. You will have to ration. You will have to make difficult choices. You will have to live the way everyone else in this godforsaken war has been living for the past 3 years." Bill's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And every time you feel hungry, every time your stomach growls and your children complain about there not being enough, you will remember this day. You will remember what it cost you to lie." He stepped back and nodded to his men. "Light it." The fire started small. A torch touched to a pile of dry straw at the base of the food stack. The flame caught, flickered, grew. Thomas Whitfield lunged forward. "Please!" 2 of Bill's men grabbed him, held him in place. "Watch," Bill said. "You will watch all of it." The flames climbed higher. The heat grew intense. The wood of the barn began to crackle and pop. Smoke billowed up toward the rafters, finding gaps in the old boards, escaping into the cold October sky. Thomas struggled against the men holding him. His wife was screaming from the farmhouse. He could hear her through the walls, but he could not turn away, could not close his eyes. Bill stood beside him, close enough to feel the heat together, close enough to smell the smoke together, close enough that Thomas could see the reflection of the flames in Bill Anderson's unblinking eyes. They stood that way for a long time, the pile of food, months of work, years of planning, the security of a family facing an uncertain winter, all of it turning to ash and ember and smoke. "Do you understand now?" Bill asked quietly. Thomas did not answer. His body had gone limp in the hands of Bill's men. Tears cut tracks through the soot that had begun to accumulate on his face. "I asked you a question." "Yes," Thomas whispered. "I understand. Say it. Tell me what you understand." The farmer swallowed hard. "I understand that. That lying has consequences. Better." Bill nodded slightly. "But that is not all. I understand that. Your men needed food. That I should have shared." Getting closer. The flames had reached the rafters now. Burning brands were falling from above, scattering sparks across the dirt floor of the barn. "What else, Thomas?" The farmer shook his head. He did not know what Bill wanted to hear. Bill sighed. "Let me help you." He stepped directly in front of Thomas, blocking his view of the fire. "You understand now that there are no neutral parties in this war. You cannot hide in your farm and pretend none of this touches you. Every choice you make, every lie you tell, every person you turn away, it all has consequences. For you, for your family, for the men who are trying to survive out here." Bill stepped aside, revealing the fire again. It had nearly consumed the entire pile now. Flames were licking at the walls of the barn itself. "This fire is going to spread," Bill said. "It is going to take this barn, maybe more. And you are going to stand here and watch every moment of it, because I want you to remember this day for the rest of your life." He turned to walk away, then stopped. "Oh, and Thomas?" "Yes." Bill's hand dropped to the pistol at his hip. Just rested there, a subtle reminder. If you ever lie to another man about having food while his family starves, if I ever hear that you turned away people in need with false words and hidden stores. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "I will find you, no matter where you go, no matter how long it takes. I will find you and I will show you that this..." Bill gestured at the burning barn. "This was mercy." Then he walked away, and Thomas Whitfield stood in the heat of his burning dreams, tears streaming down his face, and watched everything he had built disappear into smoke and ash and memory. But the story of the Whitfield farm does not end with the fire, because there was something Bill Anderson did not know, something that would change the meaning of everything that happened that morning. Thomas Whitfield had not been lying just to protect his food supply. He had been lying to protect his son. The boy's name was Samuel. He was 15 years old, and he had been hiding in the root cellar beneath the farmhouse since the moment the guerrillas appeared on the horizon. Samuel had a rifle, an old hunting rifle that his father had taught him to use when he was 12, and he had ammunition, enough to make a difference if he was brave enough to use it. He had been brave enough. When he heard the gunshot that shattered the padlock, when he heard his mother scream from inside the barn, Samuel had chambered around and started up the cellar stairs. He was going to kill Bill Anderson, or die trying, but he never made it out of the cellar because his mother had anticipated this. She had seen the riders coming before anyone else. She had seen the way her husband tensed, the way his eyes darted toward the barn, and she had known immediately what was about to happen. Mary Whitfield had grown up in Missouri. She knew what guerrilla fighters did to families that resisted. She had heard the stories from neighbors. She had seen the burned farms along the border. She had buried friends who thought they could fight back. So before Thomas even went outside to face the approaching riders, Mary had done something that saved her son's life. She had locked the root cellar from the outside. Samuel had heard the lock click into place. He had pounded on the wooden door above his head. He had screamed. He had begged. But his mother's voice had come through the wood, calm and steady despite the terror that must have been coursing through her. "You will stay down there until they are gone. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you will stay. But Mama, promise me, Samuel, promise me you will not come out until I come and get you myself." The boy had promised, and for the next 3 hours, while his father watched his family's future burn, while his mother wept in the farmhouse under guard, while Bill Anderson's men ate their first real meal in 4 days, Samuel Whitfield sat in the darkness of the root cellar with a loaded rifle across his knees and hate in his heart. He would carry that hate for the rest of his life. Bill's men made camp about a mile from the Whitfield farm that night. They had the wagon full of food. They had warm blankets taken from the farmhouse. They had the satisfaction of full stomachs for the first time in memory. But the mood around the campfire was strange, subdued. Even the men who had been most desperate for food seemed uncomfortable with what had happened. Jesse James sat apart from the others, his back against a tree, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the still-burning barn. George Todd, Bill's most trusted lieutenant, approached him. "Something on your mind, Jesse?" The 17-year-old was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About whether we are still the good guys." Todd let out a short laugh. "Good guys? Boy, there are no good guys in this war. Not anymore. Maybe there never were." Jesse did not respond. But later, years later, when he had become the most famous outlaw in American history, he would sometimes talk about that night, about the way the burning barn had lit up the sky like a beacon, about the smell of smoke that seemed to follow them for miles. "I learned something that night," Jesse would say to those few people he trusted enough to share his thoughts with. "I learned that hunger can make you do things you never thought you would do. And I learned that Bill Anderson, he was not just fighting a war, he was fighting something inside himself, something that had broken when his sister died, something that could never be fixed." Jesse paused in these retellings, his eyes going distant. I think he wanted to be merciful. I think some part of him still remembered what mercy was, but that part was buried so deep, under so much anger and grief and loss, that he could not reach it anymore. What happened to the Whitfield family? Thomas survived, Mary survived, Samuel survived, but they never recovered. Not really. The barn burned to the ground. The fire spread to a storage shed and part of the farmhouse before Thomas and Mary managed to contain it. They lost about half of what Bill's men had left behind, which meant they barely had enough to make it through winter. They did make it, barely. By spring, they had lost 2 of their 3 cows to starvation. Mary had to sell her wedding ring to buy seed for the next planting. Samuel had stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. Thomas never farmed again. He could not bring himself to build a new barn, could not bring himself to store food anywhere, knowing that it might be taken or burned at any moment. The sight of flames, even a candle, made him shake for years afterward. After the war ended, the Whitfields sold their land for a fraction of its value and moved to St. Louis. Thomas took a job in a factory. Mary took in laundry. Samuel joined the army, the Union Army, and served for 20 years. When asked why he had joined the military that had caused his family so much suffering, Samuel's answer was always the same: "Because I never want to feel helpless again. Never want to sit in a dark cellar while men burn everything I love. The army gave me training, gave me weapons, gave me the ability to fight back." He never mentioned Bill Anderson by name, never spoke about what happened on the farm that October day. But everyone who knew him understood that something had happened, something that had turned a 15-year-old farm boy into a man who slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow for the rest of his life. But here is the part of the story that most people do not know, the part that complicates everything. When Bill Anderson's men were loading the wagon with food from the Whitfield barn, one of them found something hidden behind the flour sacks, a small wooden box, carefully concealed. He brought it to Bill. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, and a small leather pouch containing gold coins, more than most Missouri farmers would see in a lifetime. Bill read the letters while his men worked. His face changed as he went through them, hardened, then softened, then hardened again. When he was finished, he put the letters back in the box and tucked it under his arm. That night, around the campfire, one of his men asked about the letters. "What was in them, Bill?" Bill stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Thomas Whitfield has a brother, Henry Whitfield. He lives in Kansas, works for the Union Army as a quartermaster." There was a murmur of anger around the fire. A quartermaster. The men who supplied Union soldiers with food and weapons and everything they needed to kill Confederates. "Those letters," Bill continued, "they were from Henry, asking Thomas to help supply information about guerrilla movements in the area. asking him to report on where we camp, where we travel, how many men we have. The murmur grew louder, more dangerous. Thomas refused, Bill said, cutting through the noise. Every letter, for 2 years. He told his brother he wanted no part of the war, wanted to stay neutral, wanted to protect his family. He held up the pouch of gold coins. This is what Henry sent him. Payment for information that Thomas never provided. Money that Thomas never spent. Bill tossed the pouch to one of his men. Divide it among the boys. Consider it payment for what we did today. There was a moment of confused silence. Finally, Jesse spoke up. So, the farmer was not a Union spy? No. Bill's voice was flat. He was just a man trying to survive, trying to keep his family out of a war they wanted no part of. Then why? Bill stood abruptly, his shadow looming large in the firelight. Because he lied to me. Bill's voice cracked with emotion. He looked at my starving men and he lied. It does not matter why. It does not matter that he was scared. It does not matter that his brother is Union or that he refused to spy for them. He turned to face Jesse directly. When you lie to a man about whether you have food while his brothers are starving, you are saying that his life does not matter, that his suffering does not matter, that he is not worth the truth. Bill's hands were shaking, just slightly, but Jesse noticed. I cannot forgive that, Bill said quietly. I cannot let that pass, because if I do, if I let people lie to us and get away with it, then we become invisible. We become nothing. We become ghosts that people can ignore while they stuff their cellars full of food and pretend we do not exist. He walked away from the fire into the darkness beyond the camp. Nobody followed him. To understand what happened on the Whitfield farm, you have to understand something about Bill Anderson, something that most history books get wrong. Bill Anderson was not a monster who enjoyed cruelty. He was a broken man who had lost everything and was terrified of losing his mind. When his sister Josephine died, when she was crushed under the rubble of that building in Kansas City, while Union soldiers stood outside and did nothing, something inside Bill Anderson shattered. Not broke, shattered, into pieces so small they could never be put back together. He started keeping count of the men he killed after that, not because he was proud of the number, but because he was afraid that if he stopped counting, he would lose track entirely. Lose track of what was real and what was madness. The scalps were the same way. People assumed Bill Anderson collected them as trophies, as proof of his brutality. But the truth was more complicated. Each scalp represented a death he could not deny, could not forget, could not pretend had not happened. In a world that seemed increasingly unreal, in a war that made no sense, the scalps were evidence, proof that he was still there, still fighting, still capable of affecting the world around him. When Thomas Whitfield lied to him, Bill saw something he recognized. He saw someone trying to pretend the war was not happening, trying to hide from reality behind locked barn doors and false words, trying to make Bill and his men invisible. And that was the one thing Bill could not tolerate. Because if Bill Anderson became invisible, if people could look at him and see nothing, then maybe his sister had died for nothing. Maybe all the blood and death and horror of the past 2 years meant nothing. Maybe he was already a ghost, already dead, already forgotten. The fire that consumed the Whitfield barn was not just punishment for a lie. It was Bill Anderson screaming at the world, I am still here. I still matter. You cannot pretend I do not exist. It was the act of a man who was losing himself and fighting desperately to hold on. 3 weeks after the incident at the Whitfield farm, Bill Anderson rode into an ambush near Albany, Missouri. 150 Union soldiers were waiting for him. They had received intelligence about his movements. They knew exactly where he would be. Bill saw them. He saw the glint of rifle barrels in the morning light. He saw the odds. 30 of his men against 150 seasoned soldiers, and he charged anyway. Follow me, he shouted to his men. Those were his last words. Bill Anderson took 2 bullets to the head and 2 to the chest before he hit the ground. He was 24 years old. He had been a guerrilla fighter for less than 3 years. In that time, he had killed more Union soldiers than most Confederate regiments managed in the entire war. When his body was recovered by Union forces, They found Josephine's dress still tucked in his saddlebag. The bloodstains had faded over the 18 months since her death, but you could still see them if you looked closely. Still trace the outline of where she had been crushed. The Union displayed Bill's body for 3 days in Richmond, Missouri, propped up against a wall, a warning to others who might think of following in his footsteps. Women came to spit on the corpse. Men came to cut off pieces of his clothing as souvenirs. Someone took his trigger finger as a trophy. Jesse James watched from a distance. He was recovering from a wound he had received in the same ambush, a wound that would have killed most men but had somehow spared him for a different destiny. He did not approach the body, did not try to claim it, but he watched for hours, and when he finally turned away, there were tears on his face. Years later, when Jesse James had become the most wanted man in America, someone asked him about Bill Anderson, asked him what kind of man Bloody Bill had really been. Jesse thought for a long time before answering. "He was the saddest man I ever knew," Jesse finally said, "and the angriest, and sometimes he was the kindest too. He saved my life once, gave me his last biscuit when I was too sick to find food myself." Jesse paused, but he could not save himself, could not escape what had happened to his sister, could not stop the rage long enough to remember who he was before the war. "And the farm?" the interviewer pressed. "The one where he burned all the food?" Jesse's face went still. "That was the day I knew he was lost," Jesse said quietly. "Not because of what he did, but because of why he did it." He looked down at his hands. Bill burned that food because he was afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being nothing. He needed that farmer to remember him, needed to leave a mark that could not be ignored. Jesse looked up. "That is what war does to men. It makes them so afraid of disappearing that they will burn down the whole world just to prove they still exist." There is a question that historians have debated for over a century. Was Bill Anderson evil? It is not as simple as it sounds, because if you look at his actions in isolation, the scalps, the executions, the burning of the Whitfield farm, the answer seems obvious. Of course he was evil. What kind of monster collects 53 scalps and braids them into his saddle? But here is what the simple answer misses. Bill Anderson did not start out as a monster. He was made into one, molded by circumstances so brutal, so unjust, so utterly beyond his control that something fundamental broke inside him. His sister was 14 years old. 14. She had done nothing wrong, committed no crime. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong last name. And she died screaming. For 6 minutes, while men who could have saved her stood outside and did nothing. After that, after you watch your baby sister crushed to death while grown men laugh about it, after you hear her call for your mother in her final moments, what happens to your soul? What happens to the part of you that believes in justice, in fairness, in a world that makes sense? It dies, and in its place grows something else, something cold, something that can do terrible things without flinching, something that sees cruelty not as evil but as equilibrium, as balance for a universe that has already proven itself to be fundamentally unjust. Bill Anderson burned the Whitfield farm because Thomas Whitfield lied, but that lie was just the trigger. The powder had been laid years before in Kansas City, in the rubble of a collapsed building, in the screams of a 14-year-old girl named Josephine. Every act of violence Bill committed after that day was really aimed at the men who had killed his sister. Every Union soldier he shot, every farm he burned, every scalp he collected, they were all substitutes, stand-ins for the men he could never truly punish enough. Because here is the terrible truth about vengeance. It never ends. You cannot kill enough people to bring back the dead. You cannot burn enough farms to fill the hole where your heart used to be. You cannot make the world pay fairly for what it has taken from you, because the scales can never truly balance. Bill Anderson knew this. Deep down, in whatever corner of his soul still functioned, he understood that what he was doing would never be enough, would never make things right, would never bring Josephine back, but he could not stop. Because stopping meant accepting that her death was meaningless, and that was the one thing he could not do. Let me tell you about Order Number 11, if you want to understand why Missouri was the most brutal theater of the Civil War, why men like Bill Anderson existed, why farms like the Whitfields were caught between impossible choices. You have to understand this order. In August of 1863, Union General Thomas Ewing issued Order Number 11. It was the most extreme civilian displacement order in American history. It required the complete evacuation of 4 entire counties in western Missouri. Everyone had to leave: farmers, shopkeepers, women, children, the elderly, the sick. Everyone. The official reason was to deny support to Confederate guerrillas. Without civilian sympathizers to provide food and shelter, the reasoning went, the guerrillas would starve or surrender. The reality was different. Union troops swept through the affected counties like locusts. They gave families hours, sometimes minutes, to gather what they could carry. Then they burned everything: houses, barns, crops, livestock. Anything that could not be carried away was destroyed. Tens of thousands of people became refugees overnight. They fled east, toward Kansas City and St. Louis, dragging what possessions they could in handcarts and wagons. Many died on the road from exposure or starvation. Many more lost everything they had ever owned. The counties affected by Order Number 11 became known as the Burnt District. For years after the war ended, they remained largely empty. The destruction was so complete, the trauma so deep, that many families never returned. Thomas Whitfield's farm was just outside the Burnt District, close enough to see the smoke columns from distant farmsteads, close enough to take in refugees fleeing east, close enough to understand that the same thing could happen to him at any moment. That is why he had hidden the food, not because he was greedy, not because he did not care about starving men, but because he had watched his neighbors lose everything and he was determined that it would not happen to his family. The cellar full of provisions was his insurance policy, his defense against a world that had proven it could destroy everything you loved without warning or mercy. He hid the food because he was afraid, and Bill Anderson burned it because he was afraid too. 2 frightened men caught in a war that neither of them wanted, making choices that would haunt them both forever. There is one more piece of this story that needs to be told, the part about mercy. When Bill Anderson's men finished loading the wagon with provisions from the Whitfield barn, Bill walked back into the cellar one last time, alone. His men watched from outside, unsure what he was doing. They had already taken what they needed. The fire was being prepared. There was nothing left to do in there. But Bill stayed inside for almost 10 minutes. When he emerged, he was carrying something, a small bundle wrapped in burlap. He walked past his men without speaking, walked to where Mary Whitfield was being held in the farmhouse. The 2 young guerrillas guarding her stepped aside as Bill approached. He set the bundle down on the kitchen table. "Open it," he said. Mary's hands were shaking as she unwrapped the burlap. Inside were seeds, wheat, corn, beans, carefully preserved in waxed paper packets. "Your husband hid these in a false bottom of a barrel," Bill said. "My men did not find them." He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "These will get you through spring planting. Use them wisely. And when someone comes to your door asking for help..." He looked back at her. His eyes were red. Whether from smoke or something else, Mary could not tell. "Remember this day," he said. "Remember that we took what we needed and left what you needed to survive. Remember that I could have taken everything, could have burned it all, could have left you with nothing." He paused. "I am not a good man, Mrs. Whitfield. I have done things that would make you sick to hear about, but I am not entirely without mercy. Not yet. Not completely." He walked out. Mary Whitfield never forgot those words. Years later, when she was old and grey and the war was a distant memory, she would tell her grandchildren about the day Bill Anderson came to their farm. "He was the devil himself," she would say. But even the devil has moments of something like grace, moments when he remembers what it was like to be human. The seeds he left us, they saved our lives. We would have starved that winter without them. Your great-grandfather never knew. He was too lost in his grief to notice. But I noticed. I remembered. She would pause here, her ancient eyes going distant. War makes monsters of men. But sometimes the monster remembers being a man. And in those moments, in those brief flashes of the person they used to be, she would shake her head. That is the saddest part of all. The reminder that they were not always this way. That something beautiful was destroyed to make them into the creatures they became. You are watching this video because something about this story speaks to you. Maybe it is the injustice of it all. A farmer caught between impossible choices. A guerrilla fighter destroying what he could not save. Families torn apart by forces beyond their control. Maybe it is the human drama, the moments of cruelty mixed with unexpected mercy. The complexity of men who could do terrible things and kind things in the same breath. Maybe it is the history, the forgotten corners of the Civil War that most people never learn about. The stories that challenge our simple narratives of good guys and bad guys. Whatever brought you here, whatever kept you watching until now, I want you to know something. This story took months to research. Every detail you heard, the names, the places, the specific events, they come from historical records, from letters and diaries and court testimonies, from the fragmentary evidence that survivors left behind. Finding these stories is not easy. Telling them properly is even harder. It requires time, resources, the willingness to dig through archives and interview descendants and piece together narratives from scattered fragments. When you click the Super Thanks button below this video, you are making that work possible. You are saying that these forgotten stories deserve to be told, that the Whitfields and the Andersons and the Jameses of history should not be allowed to fade into obscurity. Every contribution, large or small, helps us uncover more of these hidden histories, helps us bring to light the stories that the textbooks leave out, helps us remember the human beings behind the legends and the monsters. History is not simple. War is not simple. People are not simple. But their stories deserve to be told. And you, by watching, by supporting, by sharing, you are making sure they are. There is a cemetery in Albany, Missouri. It is small, quiet, the kind of place most people drive past without a second glance. Weathered headstones lean at angles, their inscriptions worn by a century and a half of rain and wind. Bill Anderson is not buried there. His body was claimed by his family after the Union finished displaying it, and he was buried in a cemetery near Richmond. But there is a marker in Albany, a simple stone that someone placed years after the war ended. It does not say much, just a name and a date, and 4 words that have puzzled visitors for generations. Bloody Bill Anderson, 1840-1864. He remembered his sister. That is all. No explanation, no context, no indication of who placed it there or why they chose those particular words. But if you understand the story, if you know about Josephine, if you have followed the thread of grief and rage that ran through Bill Anderson's short, violent life, those 4 words tell you everything. He remembered his sister, every scalp, every bullet, every burning barn and executed prisoner and midnight raid. They were all dedicated to her memory. They were all Bill Anderson's way of refusing to let her death be forgotten. It was a terrible memorial, a monument of blood and fire that brought suffering to hundreds of families, but it was the only memorial Bill knew how to build. He was 24 years old when he died. Just a boy, really. A boy who had lost too much too young and did not know how to carry the weight of it. When you stand at that marker in Albany, when you read those 4 simple words, you feel something complicated, something that is not quite sympathy but is not quite condemnation either. You feel the tragedy of it all, the waste, the senseless destruction wrought by grief that had nowhere to go. You feel the humanity of a monster, the reminder that the most terrible people in history were still people, still capable of love, still shaped by loss. And you wonder, you cannot help but wonder, what Bill Anderson might have become if his sister had lived. A farmer maybe, a shopkeeper, a husband and father, someone whose name history would never have remembered because he never did anything worth remembering. Josephine's death made Bill Anderson famous. It turned him into a legend. It ensured that his name would be spoken for centuries after his bones had turned to dust. But he would have traded all of it. The fame, the fear, the terrible legacy. He would have traded everything to have his sister back. That is what the marker in Albany really says. He remembered his sister, and the remembering destroyed him. What do we learn from the story of Bill Anderson and the Whitfield farm? Not a simple lesson, not a moral that can be summed up in a sentence and forgotten. The truth is messier than that, harder, more uncomfortable. We learn that war makes impossible choices seem necessary. Thomas Whitfield lied because he was afraid. Bill Anderson burned because he was broken. Both men did what they thought they had to do to survive. Both men were wrong. We learn that hunger is a weapon as devastating as any rifle. The men who rode with Bill that October morning were not thinking about politics or principle. They were thinking about the emptiness in their stomachs. They were thinking about the last time they had eaten a real meal. Desperation drove them to that farm, and desperation kept them there while it burned. We learn that vengeance is a fire that consumes the one who carries it. Bill Anderson spent 18 months hunting the men he blamed for his sister's death. He killed dozens, maybe hundreds, and it was never enough. The rage never faded, the grief never healed. He died still burning with it. We learn that mercy can exist in the darkest places. Bill Anderson left seeds for the Whitfield family, left enough for them to survive, left a path forward when he could have left only ashes. It was a small thing, an almost invisible thing, but it was there, a flicker of the man he might have been in a different life. We learn that history is not about heroes and villains. It is about human beings making choices under circumstances we can barely imagine. Every monster was once a child. Every victim had their own compromises. The line between them is thinner than we want to believe. And we learn that the scars of war last far longer than the war itself. Samuel Whitfield slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow for 60 years. Mary Whitfield taught her grandchildren about the seeds that saved them. The burnt district remained empty for a decade. The effects rippled forward through generations, touching people who were not even born when the fighting stopped. This is what the Civil War really was, not the grand battles of Gettysburg and Antietam, not the generals on horseback and the flags flying in the wind. It was small farms in Missouri, burning in the cold October air. It was families torn apart by choices they never wanted to make. It was young men turning into monsters and old men dying with regret. It was humanity at its worst and its best, all tangled together in ways that cannot be separated. So now I want to ask you something. After everything you have heard, after the fire and the lies and the grief and the tiny moments of mercy, what do you think? Was Bill Anderson a villain, a victim, something in between? Was Thomas Whitfield wrong to protect his family? Was he right? Would you have done the same thing in his position? And what about Samuel, the boy in the root cellar with the loaded rifle, the boy who grew into a man who never stopped preparing for violence? Who made him that way? Bill Anderson? The war? The times he lived in? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions designed to make you uncomfortable, to challenge the simple narratives we tell ourselves about history, because the truth is, if you had been born in Missouri in 1840, if you had grown up in the shadow of the coming war, if you had watched your sister die in front of you while men laughed, you might have become Bill Anderson too. That is the terrible secret at the heart of all these stories. The monsters are not so different from us. They are us, pushed past breaking points that we pray we will never reach. When you look at Bill Anderson, you are not looking at a stranger. You are looking at a mirror, a dark mirror that shows what you might become if everything you loved was taken from you. And that is why these stories matter. That is why they need to be told. Not to glorify violence, not to excuse cruelty, but to remind us that the capacity for both darkness and light exists in every human heart. And the difference between Bill Anderson and a normal man, the difference between the monster and the farmer, is often just a matter of circumstance. Comment below with your thoughts. Tell me what you think about Bill Anderson. Tell me what you would have done in Thomas Whitfield's position. Tell me whether you believe there are any truly good guys in this war, or whether everyone who touched it was stained by its horror. I read every comment, I respond to as many as I can, and I am genuinely curious about your perspective, because history is a conversation, not a lecture, and the best conversations happen when people with different views come together to share what they have seen. Before I leave you with one final thought, let me tell you what happened to the people in this story. Jesse James survived the war. He became the most famous outlaw in American history. He robbed banks and trains and became a legend that still fascinates people today. He was shot and killed in 1882 by a member of his own gang, a man looking to collect the reward on Jesse's head. Samuel Whitfield served in the army for 20 years. He never married, never had children. He died in 1912 alone in a boarding house in St. Louis. Under his pillow they found a loaded pistol. In his trunk they found a bundle of letters from his mother, saved for nearly 50 years. The last letter was dated October 1864. It mentioned something about guerrillas passing through and hoped that Samuel was staying safe. Mary Whitfield lived to be 93 years old. She outlived her husband by 30 years. She spent her final years telling stories to anyone who would listen. Stories about the war, about the farm, about the strange moment of mercy from a man everyone called a monster. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1923, one of the last living witnesses to the guerrilla war in Missouri. Thomas Whitfield never recovered from what happened. He took a factory job in St. Louis after selling the farm, but his heart was not in it. He died in 1871 at the age of 57. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, but his son Samuel always believed it was something else. Something that had been burning inside him since that October morning when he watched his life turn to smoke and ash. Bill Anderson died at 24, shot down in an ambush he could have avoided. They cut off his trigger finger as a trophy. They displayed his body for 3 days. And then they buried him in a grave that would become a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered the war and wondered what might have been. The Whitfield farm no longer exists. The land was sold, subdivided, developed. There is a shopping center there now. A Walmart, some people say, though no one knows for sure. No marker, no memorial. Nothing to indicate that anything of importance ever happened on that ground. History forgets. It has to. There are too many stories, too many tragedies, too many moments of horror and grace to remember them all. But some of us remember. Some of us dig through the archives and the letters and the faded photographs. Some of us piece together the stories and share them with whoever will listen. Because even if the Whitfield farm is gone, even if the barn has been replaced by parking lots and the cellar has been filled in and paved over, the story remains. And as long as the story remains, something survives. One final thought. There is a phrase that Civil War historians use when they talk about Missouri. They call it the Brothers' War. Because more than anywhere else in the nation, Missouri was a place where the conflict tore families apart, where brothers fought brothers, where neighbors who had known each other for decades became mortal enemies overnight. The Whitfield brothers were an example of this, Thomas trying to stay neutral, Henry working for the Union, one in Missouri, the other in Kansas, one refusing to take sides, the other dedicated to a cause. They never spoke again after the war. The letters stopped. The gold coins were never mentioned. Whatever bond they had shared as children was broken beyond repair by the choices they made and the sides they chose. That is what the Civil War really cost, not just lives, not just farms, but relationships, connections, the invisible threads that hold communities together. When Bill Anderson burned the Whitfield farm, he was not just destroying property, he was destroying the last hope that Thomas Whitfield had for staying outside the conflict. After that day, Thomas was part of the war whether he wanted to be or not. His neutrality had been burned away with his barn, and that, perhaps, was the greatest cruelty of all. Not the physical destruction, not the hunger or the fear, but the loss of the possibility of peace. Before Bill Anderson came to his farm, Thomas Whitfield could still imagine a world where the war ended and things went back to normal. A world where he could rebuild his barn and replant his crops and pretend that none of it had happened. After, there was no going back. The smoke that rose from his burning barn carried more than just flames. It carried his dreams, his hopes, his faith in a world that made sense. And when the last ember died and the last wisp of smoke faded into the cold October sky, Thomas Whitfield was not the same man anymore. None of them were. That is what war does. It changes everyone it touches. Victim and perpetrator alike. The man with the torch and the man who watches it burn. Neither of them walks away the same. Neither of them can. And that is the truest lesson of the Whitfield farm. The lesson that applies not just to the Civil War, but to every conflict, every tragedy, every moment when violence seems like the only answer. We are all changed by what we do to each other, all marked, all scarred. The only question is what we do with those scars, whether we let them make us harder or softer, crueler or kinder, more closed off or more open to the suffering of others. Bill Anderson let his scars make him into a monster. Thomas Whitfield let his make him into a ghost. What will yours make you? That is not a rhetorical question. Think about it, really think. And when you have an answer, or when you realize you do not have one yet, come back to this video, watch it again. Think about the flames and the lies and the moment when Bill Anderson left seeds for a family he had just devastated. Think about mercy in the midst of cruelty, about humanity surviving in the darkest places, and then make your choice. Because that is all any of us can do. Make our choices, live with the consequences, and hope that when the flames finally die down, something worth saving remains. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for being part of this conversation about history and humanity and the complicated truth about who we really are. Until next time, remember the Whitfields, remember Bill Anderson, and remember that every monster was once a man.